candidates for the 5th Congressional District race. We have Glenn Thompson, a Republican, and Kerith Strano Taylor, Democrat. And we're going to follow basically the same format as we did in the first segment of the forum. We're going to open it up with 3-minute opening remarks. Ms. Taylor is going to, Glenn Thompson is going to be the first up, and I'll remind you that the yellow card is 30 second warning, red means time to shut it down. Okay, shall we get started? At this time, I'm going to ask Glenn Thompson to introduce himself to us.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. What a privilege and honor to be able to be here. Thank you to the Clinton County Christian Coalition for hosting this, what is an annual event every 2 years in the life of those of us who run for Congress. Really is a privilege and honor to be here. It's great to see Kerith. We, once every 2 years, it seems like we speed date for about a month. And I appreciate her being here tonight. I want to say thank you to all the folks in Clinton County for your support, and quite frankly for your prayers for my service and for our nation. I have a lot of prayer partners here. I was with one this morning here in Clinton County, and there are so many ways that the citizens of Clinton County provided me support, but none more powerful than your prayers. I've never really promised that I'm here to bring Washington home. Quite frankly, you wouldn't want it here. But my promise has been to take your ideas, your challenges, your concerns, your problems, your issues, and most importantly, what I like to call your homegrown solutions to Washington. And you should be proud. We have been effective at doing that, at making a difference, not just for the citizens here in Clinton County, but quite frankly, the citizens all across this great nation. And my commitment has always been to listen, to lead, and to make a difference. My strategy to be effective with that, and we've been effective together, is to build partnerships. It's to reach across the aisle. It's good bipartisan work. And I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. Together we have made a difference. We've grown jobs by my national leadership for agriculture, for energy, for small business. The farm bill that I helped to write really was about supporting 1 in 7 Pennsylvanians that have their job directly or indirectly related to our #1 industry of agriculture. A strong farm bill by all measurements, supported and in a positive way, in a bipartisan way. Been appointed to the leadership for the American Energy Act, and looking forward to working on that. And we've worked together to save Medicare and Social Security through legislation to assure the future of those critical safety nets. We've saved lives and provided opportunity through legislation I've authored, serving our military and our veterans. This reduction of the suicide rate among our military. And we've invested in America's children and our nation's future with my leadership in elementary, secondary, career and technical education, and higher education. Really looking forward to hearing your questions tonight. And again, once again, thank you to the Clinton County Christian Coalition. It's a privilege and honor to be here.
Good evening. My name is Kerith Strano Taylor, and earlier this year I would not have guessed that I would be back here with you in 2016 after having run for Congress in 2014. As I might have explained to you then, but I'm happy to do so again now, because firstly, I'm really thankful that you all came out on a random Monday night, Columbus Day, to talk some politics. This has been an incredibly divisive year in our politics. It's been pretty ugly. Let's just own that. It's also been a really weird year in politics. I was a delegate for Bernie Sanders at the convention, and something that I found really fascinating amongst the folks that were supporting, and still are, Donald Trump, and the folks that were supporting Bernie Sanders, was they both agreed that our government wasn't serving us. interesting that they have something in common. The Trump supporters often said to me that it's so broken that he can't do any worse, right? They believe that this is a Hail Mary. They want someone who's going to come in and fix it. The Sanders supporters often said to me that it was so broken, but they thought that he could make it better. So we were talking about the same glass, same water, half full, half empty. And I was surprised when I learned that. And even now, as I'm knocking on doors and I come across people that are supporting Trump or supporting Clinton, everyone agrees that they believe our government no longer serves us. So who do they serve? Right? We could turn on the news and find out. Everybody familiar with the Wells Fargo nightmare? Right? 1.5 million cases of identity theft. Now, if you or I walked to our neighbor's mailbox and pulled out a credit card app and filled it out, got a card, we would go to prison. Right? But apparently the president of Wells Fargo, he doesn't go to prison, right? They were fined 3 days worth of profits. 3 days. And they were fined by something called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created as part of Dodd-Frank. This was an organization that was meant to protect us from the greed of Wall Street. Mr. Thompson, amongst many other Republican congressmen, voted against that organization from coming into existence. We need to be protected, and we need to be represented because it's all about we the people. And apparently, from my perspective and many of the folks that I talk to, they believe that our government is only serving the people that can afford to buy policy that suits them. That's not how it's supposed to work. It was supposed to work for us. But until we start sending people to Congress that remember what it's like to go to the grocery store with coupons, I don't know if we're going to get there anytime soon. So that is one reason among many that I'm running again. I'm very much looking forward to your questions. And thank you again for coming. Thanks.
Okay, first question. Should the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, be repealed?
Firstly, I'm an advocate for single payer. So let's just get that out first and foremost. If we remember when the Affordable Care Act was being pushed through Congress, and it was pushed through Congress, we weren't in a good place when it came to acquiring health insurance for millions of Americans. If you had a pre-existing condition, you couldn't get covered. If you were really sick or had a child that was really sick, you dealt with lifetime caps. Women were being charged more than men for insurance, and not just in the childbearing years, right? A 50-year-old woman was being charged more than a 50-year-old man. And most of women's health diagnostic care was not necessarily a covered procedure. The Affordable Care Act fixed many of these things. And for that, I am grateful. More women are now getting mammograms because they're considered a covered diagnostic exam and they don't have to pull $300 out of their pocket for a copay. More kids are getting physicals. More women are getting physicals because they're covered. However, the Affordable Care Act handed a whole new crop of customers to our insurance companies. And we have insurance companies that are experiencing double-digit profits that are choosing to come out of the exchanges because it doesn't make them enough money. So I would not argue that this served us, but a repeal with nothing to replace it, I think is short-sighted, because there are 20 million Americans that now have insurance that wouldn't. There are millions of women that are getting mammograms that otherwise wouldn't be. There are children that are getting vaccines and physicals covered. So, you know, Medicare has an overhead rate of 6%, and it works. So I would be a proponent for single payer, fixing what's broken about the Affordable Care Act, which that's a monumental task. But I would be going in a direction of making sure that everyone has coverage from cradle to grave. Thank you.
I actually voted to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act was, as Kerith mentioned, was pushed through, was rushed through. It was one-dimensional. There was no opportunity for input. And I actually thought that, I came to Washington after serving 28 years in providing health care to individuals facing life-changing disease and disability. I knew we could improve our system. And I was kind of excited when they were talking about health care. But then I got locked out of the room. It wasn't just me, it was my Democratic friends too that got locked out of the room, rank and file. We need to repeal and we need to replace. The bill is not the same bill we started on. I've supported probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 changes to the bill that the President has agreed to. Well, the Senate agreed to first, and then the President signed in. It notably has been flawed, very flawed. But there's so much more that needs to be done, and I'm not sure that without repealing and replacing it, it's going to have to be almost simultaneously. Premiums, your healthcare the average healthcare premiums have gone up $3,775. There was a promise it was going to be reduced. For those folks who have healthcare for the first time, and I'm happy that they have it, but their deductibles are so much, and yes, they get wellness services, and that's incredibly important, prevention. That should be a part of anything we do in healthcare. But if you can't afford the deductibles, you can't afford to get sick. Because some of those deductibles are $3,000, $5,000, $7,000 per family member. If you like kids having access to care, they took kids out of CHIP and put them into medical assistance where most physicians are no longer accepting any more patients. Thank you.
Okay, this question is, how prepared is our federal government and agencies for cyber attacks, and what can be done?
The cyber attacks is one of our newest wars. I had the privilege and honor of speaking to enlisted Army and officers at Fort Huachuca, where our cyber command is based. And I had a chance to go into the command room and look at what was portrayed as the cyber attacks coming from nation states. A lot of folks who are not our friends on a daily basis, going after our military, our infrastructure, our banking system. We know in terms of privacy, it is a real threat. We have taken bipartisan action in Washington through numerous pieces of legislation to be able to equip and to be able to fight back, to be on the offensive and to successfully defend all those things that are at risk now that we live in a cyber world and we do a lot of commerce online. And we know right down to your individual privacy being at risk. I'm not saying that this is something we need to continue to be vigilant at. Because when it comes to cyber threats and cyber attacks, as technology improves, and it does every day, it used to be once every 7 years technology would evolve. Now it's maybe once every 7 days, I don't know. This is a constant threat, and we must be vigilant, and we owe it to the American people. The first duty of American leadership is the safety and security of our nation. And quite frankly, cybersecurity, cyber safety is now it has to be one of those priorities.
I'm not sure, well, I don't know how many people have spent a lot of time studying the effect of the movement towards small government, but let's talk a little bit about Edward Snowden. Everyone familiar with Edward Snowden, right? Took our secrets and sold them to the press and is living in Russia right now. Yeah, he was an independent contractor. The effort to shrink our government has resulted in the outsourcing and massive outsourcing of our national security to independent contractors that work for companies like Booz Allen Hamilton. They're not employees of the government, right? There are more people that have higher national security clearance that are independent contractors of our government than there are government employees. Does anybody think that makes sense? And we pay more money for it, right? We pay an independent contractor more money than we would pay that person to hold that job inside of our government. So when we're talking about cybersecurity and cyber attacks, the first question I would ask is, how has this idea of outsourcing, right, because private industry can somehow do it better and for less money? Well, they haven't proven to do it better, and they certainly don't do it for less money, and our secrets are at risk. So I think we need to re-examine how we got there, right, and really look at the dollars that we've spent and the security leaks that have been writ large, right? I mean, everybody now knows some of our secrets because an independent contractor sold them to the highest bidder. So this is a great example of why I think we need to invest in our employees and pay them wages worth staying and keep our secrets secret. Thank you. Go me. Okay. It's like a dance. We'll get it right eventually.
Okay, should there be a moratorium on Syrian refugees entering the U.S.?
Okay.
Let's go with 2 minutes.
If we're going to assert that we are pro-family, how do we turn our backs on little babies that are being buried in rubble for 4 or 5 days and thankfully being found alive? There are horrors being committed in Syria right now, mostly by Russian bunker buster bombs. Horrors, absolute horrors. As a Jewish American, I'm very thankful that we came to the rescue during World War I and rescued thousands of people out of Auschwitz, right? Would my family be here if we hadn't done that? Right? This is very real. We have women and children that are suffering at the hands of tyrants in Syria, and the answer is not to turn our backs on them. The answer is to vet, much like Canada is doing, and welcome these folks into the melting pot that is our country. Do we have to be careful? Certainly. Are there checks and balances? Absolutely. And anyone who has ever imagined that somehow it's an open door that people flood into hasn't worked with anybody who's attempted to get naturalized or citizenship in this country. It's a hard process, and it takes a lot of time. There are many hoops that you have to jump through. So I think it's naive to imply that this is somehow they get on a plane and they land in America and they get to live here for the rest of their lives. It's not that easy. But if we're a nation, give us if you're tired and you're poor, right? We're a nation that steps forward when families suffer. I think it's our obligation to do that. And any night you turn on the news, you watch it. And to be fair, these are not just Muslim families. They're Christian families who are being subjected to the same horrors. So do we pick and choose? Does neighbor 1 get to come into the United States because they're Christian, but neighbor 2 doesn't because they happen to be Muslim? I don't believe that's who we are as Americans. And I think we have to do a better job at being clear about who we wish to be as a nation and help those children and families that need us.
We should never put a litmus test on religion when it comes to our immigration policy. Our immigration policy, broadly, and the refugee program is a part of that, should be guided by 2 factors, and one is certainly the national security of our nation. I talked about the first principle of American leadership is the safety and security of your families. But it's also the safety and security of not just the current families who are here, but the future families that will come here through the legal immigration process, through the refugee program, resettlement. I think that's a righteous program. You know, this unfortunately was created in 2013 with a leadership void in the White House, where the President and the Secretary of State drew a line in the sand and then redrew the line and redrew the line and redrew the line. I think what we need to do for Syria in particular is we need to work with our allies, and we need to build safe havens within Syria, ones that we provide protection and we provide adequate facilities and housing and the kids to get education, but to do it in Syria. The future of Syria is so much in jeopardy right now because the refugee program, and I understand it because of the violence and the chaos, but they're leaving a nation, it's a brain drain. So the folks who today could serve in leadership and those kids that tomorrow could, they're leaving that nation. It's been proven that ISIS has admitted that they're using the refugee program to infiltrate and getting into other countries. European Union, Germany in particular, France, we've seen what's resulted as a result of that. I support putting that program on pause and making sure that we can vet these folks. And no, we don't know who many of them are because they're coming from countries that don't have good background information. We can do better, and quite frankly, American families and future American families who will be refugees deserve to come here and not have terrorism and chaos that they're escaping today.
Okay, this is regarding Social Security and Medicare. The Social Security Trust Fund becomes insolvent in 2038, and the Medicare Hospital Fund by 2024. What steps would you take in dealing with these problems?
These were two problems. Having worked with older adults through my rehabilitation career, and as I was licensed as a nursing home administrator, therapist, rehab manager, those were the two pending crises that I thought everybody knew about when I showed up in Washington for that first day in 2009. And it's still a significant issue. We have taken action, and we have to make a commitment to save Medicare and save Social Security. Some of the things that we've done so far on the Social Security side, we have put significant reforms in a bipartisan way. President Obama signed the legislation that's being implemented into the Social Security Disability Income Program. That program was looking to go bankrupt probably within the coming year, with dramatic decreases in financial support. And for those folks who are truly significantly disabled and rely on that for their livelihood, what a crisis that would create for families and individuals. We fixed that with legislation bipartisan legislation that we passed. We also looked at trying to do some things for Social Security in other ways. They're small, but you take small steps. There are a lot of felon fugitives who are receiving Social Security checks. And I don't think anybody would agree with that. We actually had to take legislative action to fix that. On the Medicare side, Medicare, we actually passed something, a piece of legislation that was good for our physicians and our doctors. It prevented significant cuts in reimbursement. Medicare today, and it is a government-run program, but it only pays 80 to 90 cents for every dollar of cost that a physician and a hospital have. A physician or a hospital cannot afford to treat just Medicare patients, unfortunately, because of that underpayment. We did reforms on that in a significant way, looking at income limits and those types of things. Actually, in the end, it was good for all America, because not only did it extend the life of the Medicare Trust Fund, but it saved about $2.9 trillion over 10 years from the national debt and the national deficit. But there's a lot more that we need to do. Thank you.
Well, I think the first thing we have to agree on is that we're not going to privatize Social Security, right? Paul Ryan had this great idea in a budget that he proposed, I think back in 2013, to privatize Social Security, and I believe Mr. Thompson voted for it. It didn't pass, obviously, but I think we need to first, after we watch the financial meltdown, just for a moment, close your eyes and imagine what would have happened if our Social Security money was invested in Wall Street. How many people do you know that rely on their Social Security check being exactly what it is? And when the meltdown happened, oops, sorry, it's gone, right? So let's just all agree that privatization is not the way to go. If we mean that we want to preserve Social Security, we have to lift the cap, right? The earnings cap right now sits around $118,000. When Social Security was first put in place, a Democratic ideal, let me point out, the cap was set at a level that was meant to capture 80% of the income earned by all Americans. Let me promise you that a $118,000 cap does not capture 80% of the income any longer. It captures about 40% of the income. How do you expect to keep this program going if you're not putting the money into it that you need to be? So first and foremost, we need to lift the cap so that the first $225,000 that each of us earn every year is ticked just a little bit for Social Security, right? We have to keep with the times. So firstly, privatization, not an option. We have to lift the caps. And when it comes to Medicare and Medicaid, we need to make sure that fraud is being sussed out and prevented. But interestingly enough, in this same small government push that came about around 2008, 2009, guess who they cut the budget for? Investigators and prosecutors to prosecute Social Security fraud. They did the same with the IRS. So how do you expect to catch these examples of fraud if you're not willing to pay for the employees to go out and do the investigation to catch these people committing fraud? So sometimes we need to invest in our government programs to make sure they're clean and effective, and this is one of them. Thank you. Oh, next one. Oh, okay. Here's the dance again, right? We never know. I'm ready.
Can a tax rate be so high that it is not acceptable? If so, name a tax rate so high that citizens would be under no moral obligation to pay it.
Oh, okay.
2 minutes.
Can a tax rate be so high that it's not acceptable? Well, certainly. Certainly, it could be too high. I think if we were to look back at the years where we were most prosperous, right, the 50s and the 60s, when we had tax rates set that the wealthiest among us paid their fair share, look what it paid for. It paid for an international highway system, and roads and bridges and great schools and universities, and the GI Bill for the young men that were coming home from World War II, right? When we pay our fair share, when the wealthy of us pay our fair share, we do well as a nation. I don't know where we put the number, right? And I'd be more than happy to examine what the number should be. But right now, our system is set up so the wealthy don't really have to pay anything. I mean, regardless of who you're voting for president, we just heard Donald Trump admit last night that he took a $916 million loss, almost $1 billion, and doesn't pay federal taxes. We all have to pay federal taxes. It's what keeps the lights on in our government. So I think we need to do things like close the carried interest loophole, which allows different income to be taxed differently. I don't know about you, but all my income is taxed the same, right? It doesn't matter if it's a commission or if it's income and it's taxed the same. But apparently if you're a hedge fund manager, your income is taxed at lower tax rates, which saves you billions of dollars a year. That should be coming into our coffers to help pay for the things that we need to pay for as a federal government. So I am not advocating that we raise taxes on the middle class, certainly not advocating that we raise taxes on anybody earning under $225,000 a year, which is the gross majority of people that live in the 5th Congressional District. But for those that are doing really well, we should ensure that they're paying their fair share, because you and I both know that every one of us in this room, we write the check, and every American should. Thank you.
I think, although it's legal, it's just completely unacceptable to me that someone can avoid paying taxes just because they can afford an army of tax attorneys. I doubt if there's anybody in this room is in that situation that can afford an army of tax attorneys. But that's what we see today, and it's because we've used the tax code basically to social engineer this nation, and we pick winners and losers. And I think that's wrong. And it's time to simplify the tax code. I've personally supported that. Actually, I've worked in a bipartisan way. Last December, the president signed into law legislation that would make permanent deductibles for families. Family tax credit, education tax credit, and for small businesses that create jobs and provide the backbone of our economy. But there's a lot more that we, so can we set a rate that's so high that it's not acceptable or it's immoral? I think we're getting pretty close, to tell you the truth. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. You know, Japan was able and willing to do that at a time after they experienced a earthquake, a tsunami, and a nuclear meltdown. And they knew that in order to attract new businesses to their country, they needed to do something that was simpler, that was more competitive. That people come, and we want people to come to our country. We have a lot of businesses, unfortunately, that have shipped their assets offshore because of our tax code. So we need to simplify. You know, I'd like to see something along the lines of about 15%. Bring it down, make it simpler, make it so that people like Warren Buffett are not able, no matter how many tax attorneys they hire, they still, or Donald Trump, they're going to have to pay their fair share. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll get this done. I promise you within the next 20 minutes we'll have this figured out.
Speaking of tax dollars, should Planned Parenthood receive federal funds?
No, absolutely not. I voted to keep Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, let me be clear, Planned Parenthood has not received any funding for abortion. That is not something we do. That actually is, in terms of, there is an issue on the state level in terms of recognizing Planned Parenthood, but Planned Parenthood, there's no line for Planned Parenthood in the federal budget. There are services, other services that, quite frankly, that Planned Parenthood provides, and I recognize that. But I also know that there are a tremendous amount of providers out there, many faith-based providers, that would serve the needs of every woman, every child, and every unborn child without putting them at risk. And so I think it's incredibly important that we have access to good healthcare services in all of our communities. That's why I've worked with federally qualified health centers, which are wonderful organizations. They actually provide services on a sliding scale. Many of them have moved towards providing dental services as well, and I will tell you that dental is probably the most, the least accessible healthcare service that's out there. And the sad part is your dental health is tied directly to heart disease and diabetes and infection, and having access to good dental services is incredibly important. But I would not support and do not support any type of federal funding for Planned Parenthood. Thank you.
Well, I'm appreciative of the fact that Mr. Thompson made clear that tax dollars do not pay for abortion services, period. They don't. So while Planned Parenthood might provide a service that people don't agree with, federal tax dollars have never been used to pay for those services. That is raised through separate independent fundraising efforts. So we went through hours of hearings and I watched every moment of it. That is clear. There also, again, thank you, Mr. Thompson, for making sure that people understand, there isn't a line item in the federal budget for Planned Parenthood. There's a line item for women's health services. And organizations put in bids to say, we can provide this health service to cover this section in Alabama, or this neighborhood in Chicago, or this area of central Pennsylvania. And they get that bid, and they provide those services for the course of the year. And the services that they provide, that the federal government helps pay for, are women's and men's health care, right? These are screenings for STDs, they're women's breast health examinations, well baby checkups, right? That many other organizations can provide. They're not bidding for them. So anyone who has an objection to Planned Parenthood, is free to start their own nonprofit and put in their own bid to do it for less money. Competition is always good. But the reality right now is that Planned Parenthood provides the majority of women's health services across the United States. For them to immediately be prohibited from putting in a bid to provide those services because they provide a service that is protected by law seems strange to me. But again, my work as guardian ad litem representing the children that come through the foster care system, I deal with women every day that don't have access to health care. We don't have a Planned Parenthood clinic in the 5th Congressional District. And some of these women struggle to find places that they can access health care. And it's part of my job to help them find that. So I want more resources for my clients and the parents of my clients to be able to access health care, not fewer. Thank you. Next.
Okay. Should the federal government prohibit abortions after an unborn child can feel pain?
Oh, Roe v. Wade was decided, 40, oh gosh, I'm getting old, 43 years ago, in 1973. And the issue of abortion and choice has been one of the issues that I think has kept Democrats and Republicans able to raise obscene amounts of money to run for election. When people talk to me about their concerns, whether they're pro-life or pro-choice, as a guardian ad litem that works with children that don't have families and don't have resources, I often interpret their concern as their willingness to volunteer to serve as a foster parent. Because every day, I work with little kids that don't have families, that desperately need them. They're here, right now. And not everybody is willing to make that commitment, and it's a hard commitment, and I understand, it's tough. Fostering someone else's child is God's work. There's no better way to say it. But when it comes to government, stepping inside a doctor's office and helping make a decision that should be between a woman, her God, and her physician, I have to stop. If you mean what you say when you want small government, I can't imagine it once government should be in my doctor's office. I don't believe that women wish to have abortions. I don't believe they're gleeful in having abortions. Sometimes circumstances are such that they feel they have no option. So if we really mean we want to reduce them, I think we have to invest in birth control, making it available for people, and helping support families once they're here by not cutting food stamp programs and not cutting Section 8 programs, not cutting public education. So this is a really big issue that we need to chew on, and I think it's our obligation to do so, but it's not so easy to say I'm this or I'm that when we have little kids coming through our system that are being failed every day. Thank you.
It's a pretty easy one for me. I am a 100% pro-life voting record. I'm very proud of that. To me, it's about my faith and standing up for the unborn, standing up for the voiceless. I certainly have supported a piece of legislation. It's called the Pain Capable Bill, to where, I mean, these are all yet to be born unborn children who, if they have in utero, if you can determine that they have some type of medical condition that can be treated through in utero surgery, they administer anesthesia to do that. And yet, so they're very fully capable of experiencing pain. And to me, that's just wrong. And this protects unborn children when they reach that level of development, specifically where we know that they can experience pain. I work a lot on legislation and my wife and I, obviously, we raised a great nephew. We know the foster system. I support that in my work. I support legislation for unborn children who are born addicted to opioids. And I'm an original co-sponsor on a piece of legislation to be able to address that, so that give tools to the states to be able to do a better job. And quite frankly, public education on a federal level, we've actually increased authorization under the Every Student Succeeds Act for Title I funds in particular, for the offsets the impact of poverty, and so much more that maybe we'll get around to in the next question. Thanks.
Okay. Should women be required to register for the military draft?
There is a real push for that within the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm very proud of the men and women who serve in the nation today. We are an all-volunteer military. Penny and I have a son that is a staff sergeant today. He is a Purple Heart Wounded Warrior in Iraq and continues to serve today. Our daughter-in-law is retired now, but she was injured in training. I'm not sure taking that step is such a good idea. Quite frankly, I'm hoping we never ever have to rely on a draft again. I'm not looking to go that direction. There are some in Washington on both sides of the aisle that push this, a small group that push this rather strongly. I'm very proud of an all-volunteer force. I think they're proud of an all-volunteer force. They're not looking to return to a day of the draft. We've been able to meet our needs. We've been able to, I was very proud to increase funding last year, increase spending. And we did that for things other than military, but we increased specifically $15 billion towards our military because of how the administration was looking to decrease our forces. Because we need to take care of our military and make sure they're getting the right training, they're getting the right housing, they're getting the right health care, that we make them effective. And we make them lethal because they are a deterrent to bad things happening around the world to our citizens and to our nation.
There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We now know this, right? But we rushed off to war. And we sent our sons and daughters to fight in a war that I would argue has helped exacerbate the power keg that is the Middle East. If we have our daughters sign up for the selective service, just like our sons, I wonder how many families will rethink their votes when they go to the polls and who they're going to vote for. Are they going to vote for hawks? Are they going to vote for doves? Are they going to vote for people that want to take a pause and a moment and say, I'm not certain this is our fight? We now know that women are just as capable of doing anything that men can do. And they make great soldiers, and they make great pilots, and they make great army medics and nurses. Why shouldn't we sign up for the selective service? I love my country just as much as anyone else does. Why should it only be the boys that get the shot? Right? So we're on the verge of possibly having the first woman in the White House. We're capable of doing anything that men could do. And most women that I know would be willing to step forward if asked. But I think more importantly, by making the draft not gender selective, I think it makes us more responsible when we make the choice to go to war. It makes us more certain. And maybe it makes us pause before we get ourselves entangled in fights like Iraq that, let's be honest, still isn't over. Still isn't over. So, yeah, I would support that. Yes, please. Next.
Should faith-based groups be able to make employment decisions based on sexual orientation?
Should faith-based groups, okay, I gotta put my lawyer hat on here for a moment, because this is a question of law. There was a time when faith-based groups refused to serve African Americans because they didn't like them. There was a time when faith-based groups used to have lynching parties. I think we can all agree that's not where we want to go, right? That was a time in our history we don't want to repeat. So what does that mean? I remember when we were here in 14, we had a long conversation about whether pastors or priests should be forced to marry same-sex marriages. And I said, no, that's separation of church and state. A church can't be forced to, give the sacrament of marriage if it intersects with their faith. Hiring decisions? Where does that line stop? I don't know where that line stops. We don't like black people, so we're not going to hire them. We don't like Jews. We don't like redheads, right? Is that the country we are? Again, there are homosexual people of every faith, every denomination. Jewish, Christian, Methodist, Presbyterian, Muslim, right? So what? A devout Catholic happens to be homosexual and wants to work in the church, in the secretary's office of their church? They could say no. I think that's up to, it would be litigated. I don't think it's something that should be legislated, personally. I think the courts are much better at protecting the Constitution than Congress is. But I think it's certainly an interesting question, but we have to look at our history to see if it's ever been abused. And we know that it has. So, thank you.
Act has already been legislated, and it wasn't in 2016, it was 1965 in the Civil Rights Act. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, very specifically when it deals with faith-based employers, faith-based organizations. It could be a school, it could be a university, anything that is faith-based. In terms of their human resources, they have that protection under the Civil Rights Act. So if you choose to ignore the Civil Rights Act, choose to repeal that, then that's the action it would have to take. I choose to stand by the Civil Rights Act. This is about religious freedom. And I think this was the underlying principle of which our ancestors, our folks who came to this country seeking, William Penn seeking religious freedom. And